This week, our Torah portion is called Vayera, and it includes both the highs and the lows of what could be models for Jewish ethics. Now, in a humanistic congregation, we don't have to look at the Torah portion for the week. There's a lot of Jewish culture to choose from, but we're also free to look at what other Jews are studying around the world. In this case, the two chapters I want to focus on are Genesis 18 at the beginning of that portion and Genesis 22 at the end of that portion. In Genesis chapter 18, God says to itself, I've decided to destroy the city of Sodom. They are evil and wicked. They deserve to be destroyed, but I can't hide it from Abraham. He's my chosen. He's my confidant. So God says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy the city of Sodom. It's so wicked, it doesn't deserve to live. And Abraham says, what if there's some good people in that city? You're going to carpet bomb? What if there are 50 righteous people to be found in the city? Should not, and this is his famous line, should not the judge of the universe do justly? And God says, okay, if there are 50 righteous people, I will spare the city. Abraham continues to argue. But what if we're just missing 10 out of that 50? What if it's only 40 people who are righteous? Should we destroy the 40? And God says, no. Now, Abraham is a good bargainer. He comes back, a little bit of flattery, a little bit of abasement, but he says, what about 30? What about 20? In the end, he gets it down to 10. What if there are only 10 good people to be found in the city? God concedes, yes, there are 10 people, I will spare the city. As it turns out, there's only one, Lot, Abraham's nephew. All the rest are to be condemned. Lot and his family flee, and the city is destroyed. It's actually an origin story for the Dead Sea Desert, which is covered in dry sand, one of the lowest places on earth. And if you had noticed, his wife turns into a pillar of salt. And what's to be found? The Dead Sea, which is dead because it's full of salt. It's in Hebrew called the Yam HaMelach, the Salt Sea. So it's an origin story for things, but it's also an ethical lesson. When faced with what seems to be unjust behavior, even by the God of the universe, Abraham says no. He argues, he challenges the authority. In some ways, almost the first heretic. The other end of this chapter, of this portion rather, is Genesis 22. This is the famous story called the binding of Isaac. Actually, in Christian practice, it's called the sacrifice of Isaac because it's seen as being a prefiguration of another father sacrificing his son in the Christian mythology. And that's why in Christian art, for example, it's called the sacrifice of Isaac. But in Jewish art, it's not, because he doesn't get killed. It's the binding of Isaac. Here, Abraham is told by God, take the son, your only son, take the one you love, and sacrifice him on a mountain. And Abraham says nothing. Or if anything, he says, when and where, but not why, but not no. He does not argue, he obeys. Now, that story is one of the more famous stories in Jewish literature. It's one of the more famous stories in organized Jewish life because it's read every year on the high holidays, with the message being the right thing to do when faced with a divine command is not to question, is not to challenge, it is to obey, to do and do not ask. Now, which one of these chapters is the real model for Jewish ethics? Is it challenging and questioning and standing up for justice? Or is it obedience? doing what you're told. Which one is the model for Jewish ethics? Yes, they both are. Just last week, some colleagues of mine who were in Israel for the World Zionist Congress spent some time visiting with Palestinian farmers and helping them with their olive harvest. And during that experience, a couple of settlers armed with weaponry flew a drone over them, and then the drone came down and crashed, actually hit one of the volunteers, injured her arm. And then they showed up with their guns and claimed that the Palestinians had taken down the drone with stones and caused damage. It was a very tense moment. But it struck me that this is also a demonstration of both models of Jewish ethics, because the settlers think they're doing the right thing. The land is theirs, promised by God to Abraham and his descendants. And the volunteers felt they were doing the right thing, provided compassion and protection for Palestinians to farm their own land. Both claim to stand for Jewish ethics. So does the category even make sense to have such opposite behaviors? Both claim the mantle of Jewish ethical behavior. How do we know what's right and what's wrong? Is it just a question of this hurts people and this helps people and that defines good and bad? What about a sense of dignity, a sense of being free and in charge of my own life? What about being fair between different peoples? Maybe that's a category to think about with ethics. Is what is ethical what is good for the group, or what's good for the individual? Or maybe we have to find some balance between the two. After all, I could kidnap one person and take kidneys and retinas and blood and heart and help lots of people. It'd be really bad for that one person, but it would be good for the group. Most of us would say no. But that's that balance of in the individual and the group, or trying to find some place in the middle. Are there general principles of being a good person that can be flexible in different circumstances? Or do we have hard rules that we follow all the time? In the prophet Micah, chapter 6, he writes, "You have been told, O mortal, what is good and what God requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God." Okay, do justice, love goodness, but how do we know what is good? What is just? These are questions that humanity has grappled with from the beginning. Of course, yes, the Garden of Eden story, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's an origin story for why we're arguing over this, why we debate what's good and what's evil. But it's also reflected in human history. The Code of Hammurabi was written probably around the year 1700 BCE, centuries before the Torah was written down. The Chinese philosopher Confucius lived around the same time this Torah was likely compiled, around the 6th century BCE. He's also asking these questions of how to be a good person, how to be a good government, how to run society ethically. If we live together, we have to make rules. European Enlightenment philosophers imagined a state of nature where human beings were living independently and decided to come together to create society. And to do so, they gave up some of their freedom so that together they could have a successful community. It's a nice story, but it never happened. Because who was born by themselves in a cave and raised themselves by themselves in a cave? We've always lived in families, in communities, in societies, even from our earliest clans and tribes. Interestingly enough, the concept of a state of nature also appears in Chinese philosophy. A Chinese philosopher named Mozi, who lived shortly after Confucius, postulated some kind of state of nature where people came together and made a deal. The point is, the fact that there are these values, these questions being asked over and over again in human history means it's a response to the human condition. We live with each other and we have to figure out how to live with each other. It's an eternal choice among three values: me, us, and all of us. Me, the individual; us, my group; and all of us, the others, everyone, humanity. How do we balance our obligations to one, to us, and to all of us? Now, when you ask the question about Jewish ethics and what makes it distinct or unique, there's a debate. Are ethics simply philosophical positions, philosophical arguments over right and wrong and collective values? So it really doesn't make sense to refer to the ethics of a particular religious or ethnic tradition? For example, is it right to steal food to save your starving relative? You could call this the Jean Valjean example because it's the premise for the beginning of Les Miserables. Is this a universal philosophical question about private property and obligation to family and priority of needs that we can debate on basic principle? Or do we have to ask, who's arguing? What identity is the person facing that dilemma? Do you need a particular religious or cultural framework to make the decision? Are you working from a Christian ethical perspective or a Jewish ethical perspective or a Japanese ethical perspective? They've done studies cross-culturally where they asked people ethical dilemmas, and they found that different cultures answer them differently because they prioritize things differently. If you have a job you're responsible for hiring, do you hire a relative or do you hire someone who's independently qualified for the position? Well, different cultures will answer differently. Because for some, why would you hire a stranger? You can help someone out in your family, and because he's related to you, he's not going to cheat you or throw you under the bus. You know him, he knows you, you know his parents. So, of course, you hire the relative. In other cultures, that's called nepotism. In fact, not only do you want to have someone independent get hired, you would recuse yourself if one of your relatives applied for the position because it would be unfair. Put your thumb on the scale. But you can see how different cultures would both think they're making the right decision from their cultural framework. Theorists of ethics used to think that the highest level of ethical development, as described by Lawrence Kohlberg, was abstract principles that are applied universally. And then Carol Gilligan, who was one of his students in graduate school, pointed out that that seems to be often how men, by and large, tend to reason, and women tend to ask different questions. How will making this decision affect the dynamics? Maybe the circumstances are different from person to person. That needs to be factored in as well. Think of, judges making a decision on the law. Do they only look at the circumstances of the facts of the case? Or do they consider the impact on the family and the community by the decision that they make? There's a wonderful book by Jonathan Haidt, who is a moral psychologist. It's called, I'm blanking on the title all of a sudden. It's a book about moral reasoning. The Righteous Mind is the name of the book. The Righteous Mind. Because he makes the point that everybody thinks they're doing right, the settlers and the defenders of the Palestinians. And part of the problem is that we reason differently about what's right and what's wrong. We prioritize different things and have different reasons why we're behaving that way. And one of the problems in studying moral reasoning is most of the studies are done in what he calls weird societies. It's an acronym. It stands for white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And if you only do your psychology studies of why people reason morally in white, educated, industrial, rich, democratic countries, they're going to prioritize certain values like the fair hiring and de-emphasize other values like the loyalty to family and the opportunity of hiring. One of the categories Haidt describes is what he calls sanctities, that certain things are holy and you don't violate them. And if you do, it's an ethical violation. Some of you may remember there was a work of art that was done in the 1990s. It was called Piss Christ, where somebody collected a vat of his own urine and put a crucifix in it and took a picture. And many people were offended. How dare he? And this was paid for by a National Endowment for the Arts grant, so it was even worse. But they said this is a moral violation. Now, those in defense of free speech, artistic expression said, who was hurt? A person wasn't hurt. It was your feelings were hurt. But for those for whom sanctity is a category of moral violation, that was a moral violation. Now, you might think that leftists, progressive don't have the sanctity category because they're secular. But if someone had made a piss MLK Jr., you might have felt differently. So we have this category of sanctity in our mind that most of us don't think about but might apply. Or here's another example. Is it good to follow what the group does? If there's a dress code at school, is the ethical choice to follow the dress code or to break the dress code? Well, again, different people will respond differently to that circumstance, but at least you can understand how the conformity message has some kind of ethical claim to it. All right, so these are philosophical categories that may not have anything to do with ethnicity, except they clump in patterns. Different groups emphasize different values. So I have a rabbinic style compromise. You know how Solomon threatened to cut the baby in half and solved it? Here's my compromise. Ethical debates are philosophical questions from the human condition. And particular cultures have particular approaches to those debates and asking those questions and answering those questions. There's a marvelous book that explores this idea of diverse ethical reasoning in the context of the Holocaust. It's called The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal. He describes a scene that he experienced as a prisoner where he was taken into a hospital and a dying SS soldier confessed the crimes he had committed, killing many Jews in one particular town. And then he asked for forgiveness from a concentration camp prisoner. Well, Wiesenthal went back to his barracks afterwards. He didn't say anything to the man. He just walked out of the room. And he asked his friends, what would you have done? Would you have offered forgiveness to a dying man in that context? And some said yes, and some said, I would have killed him if I had the chance. Some said, who are you to forgive on behalf of the people he killed? He's treating you like just a Jew, as they were. And then after the war, Wiesenthal actually went to this man's mother and spoke with her, and she had a sainted idea of her son, the war hero. And he faced another question, do I tell her what he really did? What makes the book even more interesting than the first 110 pages that describes the setting is he asked other people, what would you have done? Priests, ministers, imams, Buddhist thinkers, Native American. And it's fascinating to read all the different varieties of responses. Many Jewish writers fall back on a Jewish tradition that you're not allowed to forgive on behalf of someone else. And so murder on some level is unforgivable because the dead can't forgive. Where Christian thinkers, because of the example of Jesus, right, offer your left cheek after your right, forgive those who persecute you, they follow the example of forgiveness. It does make sense to talk about Christian ethics and Jewish ethics, but we can still argue and think about them in philosophical categories. Certain cultures emphasize some values versus others, use certain phrasing or stories or metaphors. Now that's the question of what to do to be good. But sometimes it's also worth exploring why be good. Why we do that particular action. Is it because of the consequences, how it's going to turn out? Or is it because an authority told us to do so? Are inherited ethics the 10 commandments or the 10 suggestions? Well, we might have to decide. Humanists could argue that even though the Torah says that God said so, a person wrote that God said so, so it's still a human ethical discussion just with a puppet, presenting the message. It's all human created anyways. But that why question might determine how flexible we are, whether we have a sense of autonomy and freedom in deciding how to respond to our inheritance, and are we willing to break with traditional rules and mores as culture and value evolves? So I want us to take a look at a case study. It's a famous passage from the Torah called the Holiness Code. This appears in Leviticus chapter 19. Right, this is a passage in the book of Leviticus. It's a code of laws that's defining the good society, as the authors of Leviticus, who were mostly priests, felt was the case. So I want to take us through this, and we'll ask every few verses, what do we think about this ethically? And is this our sense of Jewish ethics? It may turn out that it's almost like a Venn diagram of our ethics, historical Jewish ethics, and then the overlap is our Jewish ethics, the stuff we like, and we might not like at all. So Yahweh, the Hebrew God, speaks to Moses, saying, speak to the whole Israelite community and say to them, you will be holy because I, the Hebrew God, Yahweh, am holy. First law, you will revere your mother and your father. As a parent, I support this. You will revere your mother and father and keep my Sabbaths. I am Yahweh, your God. Now, is keeping the Sabbath an ethical rule? Well, if you're a servant that gets the rest, you might think so. If you're an animal that gets the rest, you might think so. If you're a person who needs to work for a living and you're forced to not work, you might not think so. Do not turn to idols or make molten gods for yourselves. I am Yahweh, your God. Ethical? Not ethical? I might call it ritual, but maybe not an ethical decision. Now, is idolatry a metaphor for worshiping things instead of the true things that deserve respect? You could make that argument. You could sort of creatively respond and interpret. This is really talking about physical idols and what to be done with them. There's even a trove that was found of a Reformation period in Jewish life where they took idols, smashed them, and threw them away on purpose because they were reforming the Jewish practice of the day. Notice, by the way, the reason that's given. Why should you not turn to idols or make molten gods? I am the great and powerful I am your God. It's an authority claim saying, do it because I said so. If you sacrifice an offering of well-being, sacrifice it to be accepted on your behalf. You eat on the day you sacrifice, the day following, but the third day you have to burn up what's left. So these are rules about how to do sacrifices. If anyone eats from that sacrifice for themselves, they will be cut off from their kin. So a ritual law about sacrificing to a god, we might not endorse so much. But now in verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, you will not reap all the way to the edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest, the wheat that falls to the ground. You will not pick your vineyard bare or gather the fallen fruit of the vineyard. You will leave those for the poor and for the stranger. And the same reasoning given, I am Yahweh your God. Now this is often pointed to positively because it's caring for the poor. It's caring for the stranger who might not be able to care for themselves. They don't own land. They can't farm. Here they can get grain. They can get grapes. Sounds good to me, even if the reasoning given might be different. Also, could you imagine parallels today? What would be the modern non-agricultural version of something like this? Leaving the corner of the field, the gleanings, the grapes. Some kind of charity, right? Could be monetary charity, which in Hebrew is called tzedakah, meaning righteousness. Other examples? Do you ever have leftover clothes that don't fit anymore? Or that you don't use? The Marie Kondo, don't use it in 3 years. Get rid of it. Doesn't bring you joy. Get rid of it. Well, what do we do with them? We donate them to charity. It's like the gleanings from our closet, if not the gleanings from our field. You will not steal. You will not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. You will not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am Yahweh. This is a demand for honesty. Societies to work, you need that. Do not defraud your fellow Israelite or commit robbery. The wages of a laborer will not remain with you until morning. If they work for you in the day, you pay them that night, and they're free to choose another place to work the next day. In modern economics, we call that wage theft, right? Where you withhold the workers' wages or keep them working for you, or don't pay them what they deserve. Do not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. Don't take advantage of people who have limitations. It's an argument for caring for those with disabilities. Do not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich, but judge fairly. So, justice. So, we're seeing all these laws that seem to totally conform with a secular approach to law in focusing on what's good for people. Now, do you have to be Jewish to follow these laws? Can you find Confucius laws about justice being done and judging fairly? Of course. But that doesn't make this any less Jewish. It can be Jewish and a Chinese value. It doesn't have to be only one. What we have to avoid, however, is claiming that we invented this idea of justice. You know, as if we have the patent on being ethical, the monopoly on being ethical. Other people do things that Jews do. Other cultures think food is love. Other cultures use guilt. Other cultures think about fairness and justice. Do not deal basely with members of your people. And this translation says, do not profit by the blood of your fellow Israelite. Literally, do not stand idly by when someone else is suffering. You have to act. Now, again, the question is it just re'echa, your neighbor, or is anybody your neighbor? How do you define that circle? There's a famous saying in the Talmud, whoever destroys a life, it's as if they've destroyed an entire universe because of all the potential descendants that could have come from them. But in one version of that text, in one of the manuscripts that's very old, it says, whoever destroys a life in Israel among the people of Israel, it's as if they've destroyed an entire universe. And whoever saves a life in Israel, as if they just, well, now what sounded like a universal ethic has become the parochial, the limited, the us, but not all of us. Do not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. In other words, if they're doing something wrong, you get to tell them. Many people don't need that encouragement. They're happy to tell you when you're doing something wrong, but if you needed it, it's here. Do not take vengeance on a grudge. Love your Israelite, love your neighbor as yourself, that famous line, right? Now, is that a Jewish ethic? Love your neighbor as yourself? Well, you find it in Confucius. Jesus quotes this in the New Testament, which goes all over the world. Is that Jewish? Is it Christian? Is it both? Immanuel Kant said, do not treat others as a means, but only as an end in themselves. It gets you to the same result. Well, I think it can be Jewish, but Jewish and then the next set of laws. Do not let your cattle mate with a different kind, or sow your field with two different kinds of seeds, or make a cloth with different kinds of material. Who cares? No cotton wool blends? Really? That's an ethical category? Well, again, if you're thinking of the sanctities, remember, this is the holiness code, and you want to separate things that don't belong together, well, then you're calling this ethical. But we who might not care as much about that, well, this one, I don't check the labels on the clothes before I buy them. I'm okay mixing material. If a man has carnal relations with a woman who is a slave and has been designated for another man, but has not been redeemed or given her freedom, there will be a penalty, an indemnity. They will not be put to death since she wasn't free. Well, the ethics of sex and gender in the Torah definitely leave a lot to be desired. I'll just say that. He has to bring a guilt offering to the tent of meeting, and that's his penalty. When you enter the land and plant any tree for food, you regard its fruit as forbidden for 3 years, and you get to eat in the fourth year. The fourth year is a sacrifice, rather, and the fifth year you can use the fruit. So I don't know if there's any health basis to this. My guess is not. This is, again, a kind of ritual pronouncement. Do not eat anything with its blood. That's ritual slaughter for kosher meat. Do not practice divination or soothsaying. No augury, fortune-telling, horoscopes. Do I care if somebody wants to do a horoscope? Probably not. But they can take advantage of you, and then it's a problem. Men will not round off the side growth of their head or destroy the side growth of their beard. This is the origin of what are called peyot or payas, and also not shaving. You do not make gashes in your flesh for the dead or incise any marks on you. This is the origin of the tattoo prohibition that, by the way, is no longer in effect. You can now get buried in Jewish cemeteries with tattoos. Don't worry about it. Do not degrade your daughter and make her a harlot, lest the land fall into harlotry. Keep my Sabbath and venerate my sanctuary. Do not turn to ghosts or inquire of familiar spirits and be defiled by them. So Halloween is out. But as it began, so it ends. You rise before the aged and show deference to the old. That's also a sign of dignity. And then the last example I like the best. When strangers reside with you in your land, you will not wrong them. The strangers who reside with you will be like one of your citizens. You will love each one as you love yourself, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is saying, if you suffered, don't make others suffer. If there is a stranger, they are not other, they are like one of you. So love your neighbor as yourself means whoever happens to be your neighbor. Not the us, it's an all of us rule. These are my Jewish ethics, this line, this version, this idea. Even as I don't only do them because it appears here. I don't care about horoscopes. I don't care about idolatry. And chapter 18 in Leviticus is the one that prohibits homosexual behavior. I don't care about that law. In fact, I find it objectionable. It's none of your business what they do. This is the ultimate change. It's the why. Why a humanistic Jew might follow some of these ethics is because we find them to be ethical. We are the ones making the choice. We don't do it just because it says so in the book. Because other things it says in the books, we don't do. We make a choice. And for us, that is a core ethical value, freedom and choice and making up your own mind. It's part of our humanistic Jewish ethics. And can others have the same opinion and the same value in their tradition? Absolutely. We don't own it, we share it. So if anyone asks you, are there Jewish ethics? You can say, yes, like everybody else. It's an old saying, the Jews are like everybody else, but only more so. Well, that's true with ethics too.